Hello and welcome to the seventh session of the Found Christianities series. This series looks at each chapter of my book, Found Christianities, and gives a teaser for what you'll find in the chapter. This particular episode will be a bit different because there's just so much information about this particular group of early Christians and so much conflicting data that I've tried to simplify it as much as possible here. So today we'll be looking at the group that called itself the Seed of Seth. They didn't call themselves Christians, but they clearly believed in Christ, and as we'll see, had a Trinitarian pattern for the Godhead, and a baptismal ritual called the Five Seals. So they were certainly Christians, but they called themselves the Seed of Seth, and sometimes the Indomitable Race, or a holy and incorruptible race. And lots of their theology can be understood in light of the previous people that we've dealt with in this series, namely Simon, Menander, and Saturninus. And as we saw last time with Saturninus, a lot of his theology emerged from his very particular Christian reading of Genesis. Now, it's not a reading that any modern person would be familiar with. Indeed, it sounds quite strange, but it is certainly a reading of Genesis. And the Seed of Seth, whoever exactly they represent, we don't know any of their names, but we do know their documents. The Seed of Seth continues this pattern of reading Genesis and developing a Christian theology out of it, which might surprise you. So again, the text that we're going to focus on is, in fact, the earliest document that we can date, and that is the Gospel of Judas. The reason why we can date this is because Irenaeus mentions it in his Against Heresies at about 180. Now, Irenaeus may not have read the entire thing, but he seems to be familiar with a general plot line. So we know that we have a very firm anchor, and this 150 to 165 CE is a general estimation. So I would put my money on the Gospel of Judas knowing the book of Acts. It seems to know several Gospels, including the Gospel of John. So it can't be prior to 150, but a range of 150 to 165 seems reasonable. What's surprising to some is that the Gospel of Judas is a harsh attack against other Christian groups that view the Eucharist as a sacrifice of Jesus and who venerate the other disciples and or apostles and view them as the center and source of authority. And this ideology of anchoring Christian truth and tradition into apostles and apostolic figures really begins here in the mid-2nd century. And so there is a definite pushback. The other apostles are humiliated and shown to be worshipers of a false deity. Judas is an interesting character because he isn't the hero. He's famously called the 13th daimon, or demon, whatever that means. He receives a higher revelation, but he isn't brought to final salvation. Instead, he perpetuates the process of salvation by completing the sacrifice of Jesus's body. And that's his role in salvation history, but it doesn't end up saving Judas, and it doesn't end up saving anybody, because real salvation isn't based on the sacrifice of Jesus's body. That itself is a theology of delusion. When we get to page 47 of the Gospel of Judas, which unfortunately, as in many pages of the Gospel of Judas, has been decayed with time, and as you can see from our little graphic here, there are big holes sometimes in the pages of the manuscript. Partly this is due to modern misuse of the text, which is a sad tale to tell. I won't tell that here, but The main characters introduced are a character known as the invisible and unnameable spirit. And this is the God who is truly God, but a God who is actually beyond Godhead, a God who is beyond the creator. And this God gives birth, or gives rise to, I should say, because it's really not, birth would be metaphorical here. He gives rise to a being called the self-born, in Greek, the Aphtogonies. And the self-born is described as a great angel and a God of light. So you have a sort of father-son here, which is sounds like Christian. But the son rises by his own, out of his own. He's called self-born because he arises not directly from the Father. The Father is somehow the cause of his being, but he is self-originate in the sense that he, in a sense, rises out of himself. There are 4 attendants of the self-born. With Saturninus, we saw that there were 7 angels, and there are in Jewish tradition 7 archangels. But actually, it's a much more common Jewish tradition just to have 4 archangels. So the fact that there are 4 angels called luminaries is not too surprising here. And the last luminary gives rise to 2 demonic lords. And for the first time, we get their names. And these are names of the creator, Yaldabaoth and Saklos, as well as Nebro. Now, Nebro can be switched out for Yaldabaoth, but Yaldabaoth becomes the dominant name. But what's interesting is that in the Gospel of Judas, there are actually 2 chief angels instead of 1 who can be called the creator. Now, if we map this out, and this only gives a very basic kind of map of what we can know, is that in the theology of the Gospel of Judas, you have the invisible spirit, and then there's a sort of a cloud of light, and out of the cloud of light arises the self-born. So the means of generation for the self-born is left somewhat mysterious. But again, out of this same or another cloud of light comes the 4 luminaries, and from the last of the 4 luminaries comes Nebro, or Yaldabaoth, and Saklos. And these 2 then give rise to the world as we know it, which is far below this higher world. That's a lot to throw at you, and unfortunately, there's even more to come, so please bear with me. Because there's more to say here. Saklos orders the creation of Adam in the image and in the likeness. This is from Genesis 1:26. Interestingly, it's the same quotation, same version of Genesis 1:26 that we saw in Saturninus. In most versions of the Hebrew Bible, you have, let's make humanity in our image. But the fact that humanity isn't made in the image of Saklos is important. So it's just simply in the image and in the likeness. Adam's line through Seth becomes, or is called, an incorruptible race that is given soul and spirit by the angel Gabriel. And then God, who is probably the self-born here, ensures that gnosis is brought to Adam and those with him. So there is a continuity. The way you get into this line of Adam and this line of the saved is not literally by being of the blood of Adam. Everyone is of the blood of Adam or of the blood of Seth, but by having this gnosis brought to you and accepting it. And that guarantees your place in the chosen race. Now, the way that this develops, and there are many, many Sethian texts as I've discussed at the beginning, but the next one that we can date is, it's not actually a text, it's a report on a text that Irenaeus gives in his work Against Heresies, book 1, chapter 29. And Irenaeus calls these people, just a crowd of Gnostics, and then he inserts the word barbello. Perhaps barbello was inserted later, but this group is best not called Gnostics. It's the same theology as the Seed of Seth. Later, they were called Barbelloites, and I'll simply use that term here. In other words, the Seed of Seth is working with the concept of a primal mother goddess called the Barbello, and therefore they get also to be called Barbelloites. But we are dealing with the same basic theology. And what's interesting is that when this report appears, about 175, there's similarities with the Gospel of Judas theology, and there are also differences. And the differences indicate a certain line of development that is really important for understanding how this group evolved intellectually. And I'm only going to cover the main differences that I think show that there has been a heightened attempt to show the Christian character of the theology. So one of the big changes is that the primal God, or the invisible spirit, is directly called Father, and he has a more direct relation with a mother goddess figure, again, the Barbello. And from their union comes an anointed light who is directly called Christ. Christ isn't the self-born. Actually, the self-born is then demoted to a later generation, as we'll see in the following chart. So what's interesting here, and this becomes dominant in the theology, is that there's an attempt to really form a Trinity, not only to bring Christ front and center, but also to give a Trinitarian pattern to the Godhead. And the Godhead isn't Father, Son, and Spirit. In this case, it's Father, Mother, and Son. Excuse me. So the Barbello is an important second member here. And also what's interesting is that, excuse me, that according to John 1:18, Christ is called the only born. And in this Barbelloite report, we have to intuit this, but Christ is also called the only born. The only born appears quite suddenly here, but we can tell from later literature that the only born is a stand-in for Christ himself. So whoever was reworking this report was wanting to affirm John 1:18 here, which itself is interesting. We wouldn't call it a Christianization of the Gospel of Judas, because the Gospel of Judas is already very Christian, but you can tell that whoever is updating this report wants to make bridges to other Christian theologies of his time, which are now beginning to support a Trinitarian pattern and to put Christ front and center. So, and I know I haven't talked about all of the complexities here, but this chart shows in very brief outline what the report says. So first of all, up on the top left, you have the Father, and you have the Mother, and then you have Christ actually highlighted in gold here. And so it's a Trinitarian pattern. And then when you see autogenes out here, or the self-born, he's moved into a later generation, the son of Logos and Enia, it is word and thought. So it's not that the self-born has disappeared, it's that he has been moved aside in order to make Christ front and center. That's quite interesting. When we get to the luminaries now all have names that we didn't find in the Gospel of Judas. But even perhaps more interestingly, they are given partners. Now, the fact that the luminaries are given partners, and here their names are Charis, Thelesis, Synesis, and Phronesis, which is basically grace, will, intelligence, and thinking or meditation. You have an interesting movement going on in Valentinianism, and we'll cover Valentinus in a later episode. But in Valentinianism, there's this strong impulse to give divine beings partners, and here we see that in this updated report of Sethian theology. And finally, we have the only born, and from the only born, interestingly, or I should say from the attendant of the only born, comes wisdom. And wisdom was conspicuously absent in the Gospel of Judas. In the Gospel of Judas, you'll remember that the creator is produced from the final luminary, or the final angelic attendant, but in the Barbeloite report, you have wisdom producing the creator. And this is another way that we see the report of Sethian theology being conformed to contemporary Valentinian theology, which also presents wisdom as the mother of the creator. Now, the big question here is, how does all of this really emerge from a reading of Genesis? And it, in some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. There's a lot of things in the background, and in order to get this theology from Genesis, one has to be engaged in allegory, that is a symbolic reading of Genesis. And what seems to be the case is that these early Christians called the Seed of Seth are understanding Genesis 1:1 to refer to the God, to refer to the invisible spirit, and Barbello to be symbolically referred to as the spirit hovering over the waters. And when God says, "Let there be light," it is actually the creation of his Son, who is Christ. Christ then has 4 angelic partners who are the archangels. And from another of these attendants comes wisdom. Wisdom then produces the creator, and it's the creator who then is active in Genesis 2. He is the one who throws Adam and Eve out of the garden, who gives them physical bodies and enslaves them to corruption. That, in broad outlines, is their reading of Genesis. So we see that these Christian groups, they aren't rejecting Genesis, they are simply reading it in a different way. It isn't a traditional Jewish reading by any means, and we've left that far behind, but it is a very fascinating reading nonetheless. And there's a lot of study that still needs to be done to figure out why all these characters emerge when they do, and why there is such a development of the theology. Because as we get on into the 3rd century, we come to the Apocryphon of John, or the secret book of John, and that presents a Sethian theology that is even more complex. And you also have many other documents, Sethian documents, that appear in the Nag Hammadi library, and such as the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, or the Egyptian Gospel, the Apocalypse of Adam, and so on and so forth. And I have simply done my best to historically present what I think is the first documented Sethian theology, and compared it with a report that we have in Irenaeus. There's much more to say here, and for those who are wanting more, please read chapter 7 of the book Found Christianities, where you'll get lots more facts.